Let me begin. Mr. Childs, you described in terms of the work by KBR and the inattention to detail and the work that was never quite completed, you described that 10 months after Staff Sergeant Masseth was electrocuted, the facility in which he was electrocuted was still not properly wired. How do you have knowledge of that?
Well, sir, when the Army sustainment, or Army sent over their own team to look at the electrical, they went out to look at LSF-1, the building that Ryan was electrocuted in. And when they came back with their report, the water lines still were not bonded and grounded. So since we were just starting Task Force Safe, I went out there then and looked at the buildings, and indeed, these buildings still did not have the water lines bonded back to the electrical service at all. And this is a completely rewired building that KBR said was complete and finished. Colonel Gabbert, Commander Wyndham, and myself started going out there and looking at the project. And we would go out and look at the building and tell them that they still didn't meet the code. And the next day, KBR would come out with a crew and rework it. We went back out, and it got to the point where we would just go out there and look at it and leave and not even talk to them. And we'd come back the next day and they'd change the wiring because they knew something was wrong and they couldn't figure out what it was.
You described in one building that they sent contractors to solve the problems 8 times. Would you have knowledge, and perhaps Mr. Smith would the taxpayers be billed for those 8 separate occasions that they sent electricians to?
The way I understand it, it's a cost-plus, fully reimbursable contract, so I'm sure they're being paid for all this time that's being spent fixing all the work that they did improperly to begin with, and over and over.
Mr. Smith?
Under a cost reimbursable contract, they would be paid for all costs which were allowable under the contract, and electrical work would be allocable because they were part of this contract, and reasonably incurred. That's a problem for KBR. At the end of the contract, DCAA could have come back and said, we don't consider costs to rework again and again and again reasonably incurred. And in our post-contract audit, we recommend that the Army not pay these costs and recover funds.
But are they doing that?
I do not know. I was pleased to read Ms. Stevenson's testimony before the Wartime Contracting Commission, which suggested that she is possibly prepared to take an aggressive stance towards this.
Going forward.
Yeah,
all right.
Going forward. You know, these post-contract audits happen usually a year or so after the contract is closed.
Did you want to add to that, Mr. Chairman?
Yes. Working through Task Force Safe, working so closely with DCMA, I know that Commander Wyndham, who was the theater contracting officer at the time we started Task Force Safe, instructed the log cap agency over there to have KBR start tracking all this electrical rework hours separately. So hopefully it is being tracked separately, and we will be able to hold them accountable for all this rework.
Do any of you have any notion of whether we should be concerned about soldiers in Afghanistan? As you know, the same contractor was doing electrical work in Afghanistan. Is your sense that General Petraeus sends in a blue ribbon task force to do all of this, right? The thing is, I've not heard General Petraeus say anything publicly about this. If I were General Petraeus, I would be furious about soldiers having been put at risk as a result of shoddy work. I mean, just furious. But I've heard nothing at this point, and my great concern is what I have heard in most cases is the Pentagon really kind of saying there's not as much of a problem here as you think. I mean, Sergeant Mathes's mother was told originally that he probably was electrocuted because he took a radio into the shower with him. My colleague, Senator Klobuchar, has just described the experience of the family from Minnesota, who for 4 years were told that he died of natural causes. But should we worry about the electrical work in Afghanistan as well at this point? Mr. Childs, what do you think?
As in my role with Task Force Safe, I did go to Afghanistan and looked at the electrical work in Afghanistan, spent about a day over there. We went over there under direction of General Petraeus through Task Force Safe to see how their electrical program was. They had the exact same electrical bonding and grounding mistakes that they had in Iraq. They had buildings that were absolutely dangerous because they were the exact same problems. And I stood there that day and witnessed new work being done by KBR that was 100% against the National Electric Code, which is clearly the code they are to use in Afghanistan. And I do not know what direction that has been taken to inspect over in Afghanistan.
Mr. Peters, the description of some 60% of the work, perhaps in many cases, being done by third country nationals. Your observation of third country nationals who were there was that in most cases they were not capable and not trained. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Give us some description of that. And where are the third country nationals from?
You have them from all over. You'll have some from India and Bangladesh, Bosnians. You will even have third country nationals that are from Australia that could be trained as an electrician, but it will not be trained in the NEC or the British Standard fashion, so that it really doesn't apply.
Let me just, sorry for interrupting you, but
Sure.
You know what Kellogg, Brown and Root, KBR, Halliburton, will, after this hearing, as they have after all hearings, say, you know what? We have performed the tasks as required. They have been judged to have been effective and properly done, and we have received compensation for it, and including award fees for it. I mean, that's what they're going to say. What you're saying is you watched it on the ground, and you say these tasks were not performed as they should have been performed with qualified workers.
That's correct. They are not performing it and installing it according to the NEC or British Standard. They won't meet either code. And half the people over there they even have a language barrier because they can't understand one another because of the third country nationals are doing the work.
So you've heard now a description, and we've seen descriptions of the quality of work being insufficient. We now know that inside the Pentagon itself, an investigator has suggested there was negligent homicide with respect to Sergeant Mathis' death. The point of that is shoddy or bad work or failure to correct work that you would know would put people's lives at risk. Knowing all of that, Mr. Smith, the organization you used to work for, has given this same contractor $83.3 million in award fees or bonuses for the very work that has been described now by a number of witnesses at 2 hearings as work that was terribly done, that risks people's lives. Now, I want to ask you a question, Mr. Smith. You were removed from your job, were you not?
Yes, sir.
And you know, when someone shows up in public who has lost their job because they were removed, others would say, well, what are you doing showing up in public? Aren't you a little embarrassed about having been removed or replaced or lost your job? Tell us, why did you lose your job?
As I told you, I managed the Log Cap 3 contract up until August 2004. And in 2004, the commanding general position changed at my command. I had a good working relationship with the previous commanding general, a fine officer, Major General McManus, now retired. Also had a fine relationship with the commander AMC, General Kern, one of the finest officers the Army has ever had. And as I said, once they left, new commander came in, things seemed to change. At that time, I was pursuing a policy that was aggressively trying to get KBR to comply with the contract, especially in the area of business systems. We could not get reasonable proposals out of them. DCAA had told me in audits all their business systems were non-compliant. And so at the time, I was on the verge of threatening unilateral definitizations. We had instituted the 15% withhold, and so I was removed from that position. I wasn't fired from the government. I had another job, served for a couple more years.
But you were raising questions, and you were being a pain.
I was taking an absolute different tack
Right.
in managing the contract.
Questions about billing and so on, and,
So forth.
and KBR and others very likely had you removed, at least from previous testimony